Hello, everyone. Joining us today is Editor-in-Chief at iPolitics, Marco Vigliotti. Thank you for making the time.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me.
All right, so we'll get started off with, so for Canadians and even politicians, yesterday was weird, busy, and unpredictable. So can you explain the timeline of events that took place yesterday in the B.C Port Strike?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's wild. The day started off with a ruling from the Canadian Industrial Relations Board. The board is the provinces have their own labor relations board, but since the port falls into federal jurisdiction, any rulings, any issues have to go before the Industrial Relations Board. So the Port Employers Association, which represents the businesses in these talks, filed basically an application with the Labor Relations Board saying the strike, the resumption of strike activities on Tuesday was unlawful. And the board met overnight on Tuesday and then issued a ruling early Wednesday morning saying that they agreed that the strike activities were illegal because the union did not offer 72-hour notice. Now the union later in the day said they would appeal the decision, saying we never, our initial 72-hour notice that we gave was still valid because we never stopped striking. But it's kind of a moot point at this stage because the 72 hours would elapse by Saturday. But nonetheless, that ended the strike activities immediately, and it was announced that workers would return to their job Thursday at 1 in the morning Pacific time. So that was a huge shock. No one was really kind of anticipating that, but it put the strike on pause temporarily. However, the union quickly responded by filing a new strike notice saying we plan on striking on Saturday at the end of 72 hours, provided that there's no deal reached that ends this. So again, the pressure goes back to on the federal government. How are you going to end this labor disruption? And we reported that the Prime Minister was convening the incident response group to look to discuss the BC Port Strike. So the incident response group was something that was started that the Prime Minister, I believe it's something that he's been doing for at least the entirety of his term, I would think. It's a special kind of collection of cabinet ministers who are convened to discuss major events. So this is the group that was convened at the onset of the COVID pandemic, during the Freedom Convoy protest, and during the start of the Russia-Ukraine war. So they met, I believe, for a few hours yesterday afternoon. The Prime Minister's office released a readout where the Prime Minister again expressed his frustration with the ongoing strike, and called or asked the advice of his ministers on how we could bring a resolution to it. So that happened. He also spoke with the Premier of British Columbia, again reiterating some of his concerns about the strike continuing. And then finally, as you know, we're going into the early evening hours, we got word that the union has actually rescinded the strike notice. So now there is no active strike notice in place. The agreement, the tentative agreement that both sides had reached last week, the union still says they aren't supporting it. So we have no clarity on what's going on there, but there is no plan to resume strike activity. So right now, ports are open, but of course the businesses are really concerned, saying how much longer until the strike returns. So without a deal in place, it's really all up in the air. But all we know right now is the ports are open. There's no striking currently planned for the next 72 hours, but still a lot of uncertainty right now.
So do we know exactly the reasons why they revoked their 72-hour strike notice? Was it from a regret of economic impacts? Because I know that was one thing I heard, but if they don't have a deal and they still are opposed to the tentative agreement, wouldn't it cause the exact same situation that took place yesterday?
Exactly, right. There's concerns that we're just going to get a repeat until we have a deal in place. The union said that, the union's concerns basically boil down to what you just said, economic uncertainty. They think the length of the tentative deal is too long. It's 4 years. But what they're really trying to say is with inflation, doing this up and down, yo-yo effect where it's rising one week and it's down the next, we feel like, signing on to an agreement that sets our wages for that long is not really going to be helpful. We want a shorter term that allows us to kind of adjust and kind of renegotiate things to reflect the new economic reality. That being said, they are being offered close to 20% pay hike over the 4 years, and I believe almost 19% increase in retirement benefits and on average $3,000 signing bonus. So the Employers Association is saying that's a pretty lucrative deal. But what they're trying to say is, yeah, there's too much economic uncertainty for this long of an agreement. That seems to be the big sticking point right now. At least that's what they're saying publicly. But again, to your point, yes, if they don't sign on to this, we're going to get continued uncertainty. The industry is very worried. Ships don't know what to do. Industry doesn't know what to do. Like everything is slowed down. Production is slowed down as we await a resolution to this.
Okay. Have any of the ministers, Minister O'Reilly or Minister Algabra, commented on the decision to revoke the strike notice in formal statements or anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I've heard so far was from Minister Reagan's office, where they really didn't go too deep into it. They just said that they were happy that there was no strike activities planned, and the focus was on work finally restarting at the port. I think right now the focus is on the work resuming, but also hoping that the vote on this tentative deal actually happens, because the union has decided not to advance it to a vote by their entire membership due to the concerns. So the union's internal caucus, it's a bit of a mess. So you have the president and the executive who agreed tentatively to accept the agreement, but then they took it to what they call their internal caucus leadership, which is made up of representatives of different types of working groups that are part of the union membership. And they said, this deal doesn't work for us. So as a result, they refused to bring it to a ratification vote of the membership. The hope is that that will change, and that the union will eventually bring it to a full vote by the membership, who will hopefully approve it, ending the strike. But right now, that's all I'm hearing from the Labour Minister's office is it's good that ports are open again. We're hoping that we can get a resolution soon.
Okay. Now, what is the possibility that negotiations continue, disputes between both parties continue to grow, and the tentative agreement is voted down and they file a new strike notice? What is the possibility of that happening?
Yeah, I mean, the possibility, it's so tough to determine what exactly to expect. I mean, there's always the possibility that the union says, we've reconsidered and we're going to bring this to a vote. But there's also just equally a possibility that they say, no, the deal doesn't work for us and we're backing away and we're going to resume and we're going to issue a new strike notice. So at this time, it's really impossible to know exactly what the plan is, unless you're a member or you're a part of the union leadership. It's uncertain. I mean, negotiations could blow up. And then, of course, there's always the risk that the federal government is going to put in place back to work legislation. From what I've heard, that if they choose that route, it will likely come with, I shouldn't say likely, but there's a possibility that it comes with binding arbitration, which means that, the two sides state their case, a neutral arbiter determines what the best deal is, and they do that. And that deal could be more lucrative or less lucrative than the one on the table. So the government hasn't said whether they're going to do this. They still want a deal done at the table, but this clear frustration is growing, and that the government's made it clear that this can't go on for much longer. I want to get some clarification on something. So Premier Ford tweeted yesterday, with Parliament being recalled to address a port strike, I'm urging the federal government to use this time to quickly pass their bail reform bill. We can't keep losing innocent lives at the hands of dangerous criminals who are on our streets when they should be behind bars. So the first part of the tweet incited that Parliament is being recalled to address the port strike. Was there already a decision made by the federal government to recall Parliament, and did they consult with Premier Ford? From what I've been told, no. There's been no decision made to recall Parliament. I don't know where the Premier got that information from. It was brought to my attention yesterday, but there's been no decision to recall Parliament. From what I've been told, and maybe the Premier saw that some news stories, some sources out there incorrectly state that the strike that the federal government was going to bring back Parliament, but there's been no indication from the federal government at this moment. I mean, it's always a possibility, of course, but nothing yet. So I saw a CTV News video back during the PSAC strike of Thomas Mulcair stating the defeat of back to work legislation could be the defeat of a Trudeau minority government. So I don't know if you saw the video. I'll pull it up here so you can have a listen here.
Trudeau has been benefiting somewhat from this in the sense that people often see him as not the best administrator, not a great manager. 31% increase in the number of bureaucrats since he got there 7.5 years ago. That's hard to explain away. So standing up to the unions, being seen to be strong on negotiating, pushing back, I think that can only help Trudeau. He's got to be careful of one trap, because if push comes to shove and we do need back to work legislation, he doesn't have a dance partner. The NDP will never vote for back to work legislation. The Bloc will never vote for back to work legislation. And the Conservatives are just going to make this simple political calculation. Do they want an election sooner or later? Because if they all vote against the Liberals, by definition, the government's saying that it needs legislation to force workers back on the job. If that doesn't go through, that is obviously a question of confidence. So we'll see whether that ever comes to pass, and it'll be something that might be totally out of the blue.
Is that statement correct? And do you think Pierre Poilievre would vote against a bill that forced workers back to work so that the government would fall? Or do you think he would vote for back to work legislation instead of playing politics?
Yeah, it's one of the big questions here, and there's a lot of open speculation. All I've heard from the NDP is that there's been no kind of indication that if back to work legislation was tabled, they of course stated that they would vote against it, but they're not necessarily telling me whether that would end this confidence and supply agreement they have with the Liberals. And the Conservatives are also being kind of coy. A statement from the party spokesperson yesterday said, if Parliament was recalled, we would, do the work asked upon us. But in terms of whether or not we'd support back to work legislation, we don't know at this time because nothing's been presented to us. So they're both being kind of coy with how they would respond. I think that's partially due to the fact that they don't want to give the government an easy out. They don't want to relieve the pressure on the government to let the negotiating process go through. So I think the Conservatives, part of me thinks, the Conservatives, despite the posturing, would ultimately support back to work legislation. I don't really know. I couldn't really foresee that not happening. But that being said, I don't think they want to give the government an easy route out by saying, yeah, sure, bringing back to work legislation to end this.
If this strike is over, there is still more political drama on the horizon with a potential cabinet shuffle in the federal government. So who do you think will be swapped in and swapped out of the Trudeau Liberal cabinet?
Yeah, it's really tough. I mean, I've heard some chattering about, I think the big name that people discuss as a almost for certain to be shuffled out of their role is the public safety minister, Marco Mendicino. He's had a rough few months with the firearms bill, with the Paul Bernardo controversy, and of course, the ongoing China interference controversy that we've seen kind of wrap up the hill for the past 3 or 4 months, not longer. Other names I've heard bandied about as being possible, possibly being moved to different roles is the Public Services and Procurement Minister, Helena Yazic. But, to be fair, that's really the only two names I've kind of been hearing. There's a bit of chatter that, there might be a change at the finance level, but be really tough to see Chrystia Freeland moving to a different role. So right now it's all just wild, rampant speculation. But we are told, or the rumor mill is churning, that we can expect a cabinet shuffle soon. So we'll just have to wait and see exactly how that pans out.
Right. Editor-in-Chief at iPolitics, Marco Vigliotti. Thank you for making the time.
Of course. Thanks so much.